Okay, we're going to get started on the second video now of Unit 1, and we're going to get into talking about what basically is psychology, and we're going to talk about what are the first two schools of psychology. What exactly is psychology? Well, first off, we're going to talk about the fascination of it. One of the cool things about teaching psychology is the fact that it is so incredibly practical. What that means is it can relate to just about everything in your life. We get into subject matter and talking about all kinds of things from love to hate, relationships, getting into procrastination, talking about studying, talking about intelligence, getting into all kinds of facets. And basically anything that you have as far as a behavior, any actions you do, any emotions you feel, all of those things comes right down into psychology. So from basically birth to death, we are studying about all types of human behavior and all types of human existence. And that's one of the really cool things about teaching psychology and studying about it, is that it relates so well to everything. So as a result of that, then number two, representing a way of thinking, one of the other big things about psychology that's very fascinating about that is it's a way to be able to learn and to improve on yourself. And that gets us into the third one, which is building knowledge. The better and the more that you can learn about yourself and to improve on such things as your self-image and your self-concept, and being able to learn a little bit more about who you are, because that's a very important concept. Who exactly are you? We ask that question a lot of times when you go in for a job interview. Your prospective employer will say, well, tell me about yourself. And a lot of times students aren't able to do that, and even adults. You go out on your first date, and and your person that you're going out with says, well, tell me a little bit about who you are. We really don't know. Because we don't take time to think about who we are and to learn about that. The other part of that is, when it comes to the building knowledge and representing a way of thinking, is being able to relate to others and being able to know who other people are, because that's a big part of psychology as well, is being able to understand how other people relate to you and how you relate to them as well. So that's kind of why we study psychology, and what are some of the cool things about it. Exactly what is psychology? Well, it's a science that studies behavior, which is our actions, all the actions you do. Your physiological, and that's dealing with all of your emotional and all of your internal feelings that you have, and why we feel the way we feel on certain different types of moods, and when different kinds of actions happens to us, how we react to it. And then the cognitive, that is dealing with the actual mental, and dealing more with why we think the way we do, because we're also very different. We both could have the exact same action happen to us, and one of us may end up crying, one of us may end up laughing, one of us may get very angry, and then the thoughts and ideas and problem solving skills that comes across dealing with that very same action could be different for two different people and three different people. So again, that's why psychology is very gray in terms of that theoretical diversity, is because the fact that there just isn't one set patent answer for how we all behave. All right, getting into schools of psychology basically and how that works. First off, talking about the guy who invented or came up with the concept of psychology. His name is Wilhelm Wundt, and he was a German professor, and basically he had a problem when he was doing his studies. He did not want to do just philosophy, because the problem with that is it's not data driven, it's not empirical, there is no research behind philosophy, it's just basically theory. The other problem he had is the sciences, biology, chemistry, those kinds of things. They were too driven by science and too driven by data, and they weren't able to be open to interpretation. So he wanted to find some type of a study that had both. And that's why he came up with the concept of psychology then. The first area that he wanted to study about was the mind, the conscious state. Why do we think the way we think? And do we all think the same way? And so basically from 1883 to 1893 then, over the next 10 years, after Wilhelm Wundt came up with this, there were psychology labs springing up all across the world, but really in the United States, it took off as a really major fundamental type of study in college universities. One of the first areas of psychology, schools of psychology, was developed by Wundt, along with another guy, Edward Titchener, who was a student of Wundt's, and they developed the concept called structuralism. And what this looked at was analyzing the conscious, which means the mind, into its basic elements. and to investigate how these elements are related. What he wanted to look at and what he wanted to study about was he wanted to get into the ideas about what are the feelings that we have when it comes to our the ways that we think. And one of the things that structuralism, one of the downfalls of structuralism, had to do with the data. Even though Wundt was all about data driven, you're talking about the 1800s when there wasn't a lot of technology to be able to help with this data. So what they would do is use what was called introspection. Careful self-observations of one's own conscious experience. So they would do, for example, they would have an experiment where they might have the subject be startled or scared in a way that they would maybe explode a balloon behind them without them knowing it or something to that effect. And then they would want to have them share what was the feelings that they had inside. They were wanting to get into the basics of explaining about the what of someone and the how. So you would ask somebody, how did that make you feel? What was going on in your mind when that balloon exploded? And then they would continue into those kinds of questioning to kind of get the answers. And then they would take these answers from all the different test subjects and they would try to somehow put them into neat categories or neat structural ideas that here's how the typical human thinks when they have a balloon exploding behind them. Well, the problem again was that doesn't work because we're also very, very different and we all don't act the same. So that led us then to the second type of school, and that is called functionalism. Functionalism is based on the belief to investigate the function. Now, function means purpose, and again, this is important as you're taking down these notes to write down kind of some of the stuff I'm saying too, not just what's on the chart, but the purpose of consciousness rather than the structure. So now we're going to ask the question of why. Not just the how and the what, but the why. And this is where the big difference between the two comes into play here. Functionalism really got into talking about this idea that we're not all the same, that we all do have a different stream of what we call consciousness, which is our free-flowing thoughts continually floating through our brain, and we're never at one point or one time being able to really focus in on one set thing. The stream of consciousness became later on what what Freud will talk about as the unconscious mind. But for now, the guy who created this concept, his name is William James. He created the second school of psychology then, and dealing with this concept. And it did focus on a lot more on being able to look at the development of humans as we grew as a species over time, and it also looked at the concept of being able to learn how we developed and adapted through survivability, and that's what kind of led to the Charles Darwin theory about how our minds and how, psychologically speaking, how we developed from very primitive to very advanced individuals and how that all came about. Again, one of the main areas of consciousness, or one of the areas of psychology, is the study of the mind. And that's really what psychology is all about. And literally, the word psychology does mean study of the mind. So that's going to take us to the end of our second video now. And again, in class, we will kind of go over a couple of videos on this to help explain it again, and maybe do some activities as well. Make sure you did get the worksheet done for tomorrow, and we will see you in class then.